Ready to go?
Sure.
Hi, so I'm Brendan Sasso. I'm a reporter with The Hill newspaper. I'm excited to be on the panel. Here we have Congressman Rick Boucher, who of course was the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. He's now with Sidley, Austin. Congressman Cliff Stearns, who was also on the Energy and Commerce Committee and chaired the Oversight Subcommittee. And he's now with APCO worldwide. And Congressman Tauke, who of course was with Verizon as a vice president. So I want to skip over opening statements, but I will start with sort of a general question that I think will give everyone a chance to weigh in. So I'm just wondering, from your point of view, what's the biggest or most important tech issue that Congress is likely to address in this Congress?
Where do you want to start?
We could start at this end.
Okay. This will be a Congress, I think, largely characterized by not addressing things rather than addressing things. But within the realm of what may be done, I think an amendment to APCO, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, is likely. You have bipartisan bills pending in both the House and the Senate. In the Senate, Chairman Leahy of the Senate Judiciary Committee is chief patron. Bob Goodlatte, chair of the House Judiciary Committee, has expressed support for reform, although I don't think to date he's introduced his own bill. Three major bills are pending. Substantively, they're identical. And the core of what they do is require a warrant based on probable cause anytime a service provider is required to surrender personal email to a governmental agency. Currently, there's what's known as the 180-day rule. So the emails that are older than 180 days can be accessed with administrative or less formal requests. That would be eliminated by this change, and a warrant based on probable cause would be required anytime personal emails are accessed. It contains some other provisions. For example, the rule with regard to corporate emails would remain essentially as it is. So this is a change primarily that is focused on personal emails. There's broad support for accomplishing this, and I think it's very likely to happen. The other thing that I think you can expect to see is a focus on spectrum. The incentive auction legislation was adopted in the last Congress. The FCC is now in the process of establishing the auction rules. And in the House, at least, I think you'll see the Communications Subcommittee spend a great deal of time and effort in overseeing the development of those auction rules. And the primary emphasis there is going to be, let's keep the auction open, let's enable carriers to bid for the spectrum that they need to serve their customers' demands, and let's maximize revenue, given all of the various needs that Congress has assigned for the auction revenues, including building out the first responder network, compensating broadcasters for the donation of their spectrum for the auction, compensating broadcasters for their repacking costs, and of course, deficit reduction. If you're going to realize that level of spectrum receipt, it's really important to let all of the bidders take part in the auction and welcome as many in as possible. So I think you're not going to see a tremendous amount of activity, but some important things will happen nonetheless.
Good morning, and I'm delighted to be here, and it's so nice to see a lot of people that when I was in Congress who had come lobbying me, and to see them again in a different light. And I would say to all of them, now that I'm out of Congress, feel free to come by and see me. My door is always open like it was before. Let me just say that I agree with Rick that very little is going to happen. Greg Walden, the chairman of the Telecommunications, is having another hearing on the future of video. Now, I don't know how many we had when I was in Congress, but he's continuing to have that. It's coincidentally, when Rick was chairman of the Telecommunications Committee and I was the ranking member, Rick did a superb job of getting a consensus on net neutrality. And he brought in Verizon, AT&T, and all the privacy groups and everybody, and he actually developed a consensus. He had these meetings, I think, over a year and a half. And we had the bill, we had Waxman agree to it, and my job was to go to Speaker Boehner and to convince him and Joe Barton. And I went to both those people, and I had a little more trouble with Joe Barton than I had with the Speaker. But the long and short of it, without Rick Boucher and I there, nothing's going to happen. When you look at the issues that Rick just talked about, spectrum policy, he did mention Stella reauthorization, I think is big on the dock. National broadband plan that the FCC issued, their goals are still in place. He mentioned first responders network, that's going to be a topic. But I think it's all going to come down, at least perceptionally, is the convergence of the telecommunications and media. And that, I think, really goes to the heart of this Policy Institute, the Technology Policy Institute's theme, which is creative destruction and growth. When you heard Stanton Dodge talk, Dish, the executive at Dish last night, he really touched on how difficult the market is in trying to succeed, and how Dish is trying to reach out and merge with other companies, particularly in the mobile device, so that they can pick up all those customers, because they see this enormous creative destruction that's coming. When you and I sit down to decide whether we're going to get video at home, are we going to do it by streaming? Are we going to do it by downloading? Are we going to do it off our mobile device with beaming? So we see right away the opportunities as a consumer, what he or she's going to do. And so towards that emergence of telecommunications and the media is really, I think, the crux of what we're talking about that Congress should be focusing on, and where all the energy, I think, of the large companies are going to do it too. The other aspect about this creative destruction is what is the United States government going to do with cybersecurity? Right now, there are 24 bills in the House and Senate, and none of them have really passed. There are 4 bills that have passed the House alone, 16 in the House and 8 in the Senate. So you see here we have this national security problem. GAO has come out with a report saying that we need a cybersecurity bill, but there's no consensus in Congress on this extremely important issue, which goes to the heart of what Rick said, that very little is getting accomplished. And there'll be amendments on the appropriations bill for cybersecurity, but again, it'll end up being a CR. And having been in Congress where you would vote again and again for appropriation amendments, to see a CR at the end after 150 hearings and appropriations and nothing getting passed, but a CR is very frustrating as a member of Congress. So I think I would say that, agree with Rick that very little is going to happen, but I think stellar reauthorization, perhaps first a responder network, and probably more hearings on telecommunication and media merging.
Good morning. It's great to be here again in Aspen at this conference, and it's good to see so many of you for this panel of either senior statesmen or has-beens, depending on how you look at it. I think that it is fair to say that Congress is having difficulty on the production front in recent years. We're going through a period, it's not unique historically, but a period where Congress is deeply divided. There is difficulty in producing legislation, and that has certainly been true on the telecom and communications issues, despite the fact that, at least in my view, there is great need because the policies are so obsolete. I agree with what Rick and Cliff said. I think that one of the encouraging signs that in this Congress is that the House Energy and Commerce Committee has quietly established bipartisan working groups on spectrum policy, which needs major overhaul in my view, and also on privacy. I believe there's a reasonable chance that the similar task forces will be established on video and on internet governance. And if you get those task forces working in a and thinking about these issues, and that's what it takes. These members have to think about these issues. If that begins to happen, then I think that we may look back a few years from now and say that was the foundation for some major overhaul in the policies, the obsolete policies that now are governing this space. So I think that is the most encouraging thing that is happening in the Congress. I will just say, well, it's not directly on topic, Brendan, but thinking about the last presentation, one of the challenges I believe that we face in the industry, which is how do you encourage investment in infrastructure? And we spend a lot of time in these conferences talking about the impact of regulation on investment. I think there's another issue that at some point needs to be addressed, and that is the focus of Wall Street on return on investment. As long as the focus is on return on investment, it's very hard to get companies to commit to long-term, to investments that have a long-term, a rate of return that is long-term. They need the near-term return on investment. And the near-term return on investment usually is focused on improving systems and trying to improve the efficiency of companies, because the ROI there is just so much better than it is for long-term investments. So when you're talking about things like fiber, I'd say that this is a big problem, is that it's a long-term commitment. And the return on investment doesn't match what you can get if you spend time on improving the efficiency of operations. This is a relatively new challenge in the U.S., but it's a very significant challenge for any infrastructure industry. And it is one of the things that somewhere along the line we have to address. If you, in my judgment at least, if you are focused on return on investment, it's very hard to get companies to cannibalize themselves. And frankly, companies, to survive in an industry with fast-moving technology, they have to cannibalize themselves. That, frankly, has been one of the keys to success at Verizon. But, as one of the charts showed, it isn't necessarily rewarded by Wall Street. The second observation is that it's very hard to get investment in innovation when you're focused on ROI. Because again, innovation is more risky, it takes longer oftentimes to get the return, so you're focused on, again, going back to improving your operations and improving efficiency. So I just offered that as one of the challenges I think we face when we're talking about how do we improve the infrastructure, encourage innovation. And it's not necessarily a public policy issue, but it is an issue that is having big impact. Thank you, Brendan.
Right. So it seems like everyone agrees that the Congress isn't likely to be especially productive. I'm wondering why that is. Is it just partisan division, split power of control? I'm wondering whether Chairman Walden's position is also leading the NRCC. He has a lot of fundraising responsibilities. Is that partially taking away some of his focus on these technology issues? Are these working groups maybe growing out of the fact that he has these other responsibilities and can't devote all of his attention to these tech issues? And we don't have to go in order if anyone wants to jump in.
I'll start on this. The problem is the Senate. Now we're all House members, so of course we say that. But the House has been relatively productive on the communications policy issues over the last decade. But the Senate is just not interested. I mean, you need to have leaders who are interested in a set of issues. If you get chairman of committee and the relevant committees and subcommittees who don't have interest in the issues, and it's not on their agenda or their priority list, it's really tough. And right now, I think it's fair to say that we have not had the kind of energy focused on telecom issues in the Senate for at least a decade.
Well, Brendan, I'd sort of agree with you. I know in one respect that if you're running the NRCC, and in the last cycle, the NRCC spent $85 million, and they ended up approximately $18 million in debt. Now, if you're going to run an operation like that, that's a full-time job. And all members who are chairman of subcommittees and full committees all have to raise and give a huge amount of money. So there's a cycle here that the money has overcome almost a legislative process, because you're involved with constantly raising money and to show that you're capable of doing that. And the fact that you have one person who's chairman of the NRCC, and then he's chairman of the Telecom Committee. I mean, instead of saying what is the future of video, perhaps a hearing on what is the future of a new Telecom Act. The Telecom Act in 1996 should be revised. It should be, the fundamental premise of that bill should be outlined in hearings in the House and then perhaps in the Senate too. So as much as I think Tom has indicated the Senate's the problem, it's always been the problem, at least on the Republican side. But in a larger sense, I think those two jobs are in themselves so enormous and require so much intellectual acumen to understand that I'm very concerned that the aspect of one man doing both jobs creates not necessarily a conflict, but it also provides a difficulty in being a master of any one.
I'm going to differ from that just a little bit. I think Greg Walden is extraordinarily talented and capable, and I think that Tom is right, that what Greg is choosing to do is study first and then act later when all the facts are known and the options are outlined and some elements of consensus can be developed. In addition to the task forces that Tom identified, Greg has also established a task force on the telecommunications equipment supply chain. This is a very constructive approach to the challenge of cybersecurity, recognizing that essentially all of the telecommunications equipment emanates from factories overseas, and most of it comes from China, whether the vendor in the US is a Chinese company or whether it's a Western-style company. The equipment basically comes from the same place and can be affected by a common level of cybersecurity vulnerability. And given that reality, this task force, established on a bipartisan basis with bipartisan chairs, is looking at how we can address that problem constructively and assert some standards for cybersecurity protection that don't materially interfere with the ability of carriers to access and purchase the equipment they need in order to deploy their networks. This is a real challenge, and I think Greg has addressed that appropriately by studying first, collecting the facts, developing consensus, and then legislating later. There are a few people, I think, in the Congress who would be capable of undertaking the dual responsibilities of chairing the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee and also chairing a major subcommittee. Greg is one who can. And I don't think the paucity of legislation on telecom subjects generally can be laid at the door of his dual responsibility. Tom is fundamentally right. The problem is the Senate. I'm reminded of John Dingell saying that the Republicans are the opposition, but the Senate is the enemy. I'm not going to go quite that far, but there has been a lack of focus there. The Commerce Committee in the Senate has certainly not had telecom at the forefront of its list of priorities. And a series of chairs of that subcommittee had other major committee responsibilities and prioritized those over the telecom work. And to a large extent, that hasn't changed. And so, you know, I think you're going to see the House committee be more active, largely with oversight and with task force work. The problem is you don't have a bicameral devotion to enacting legislation on this set of subjects.
I want to ask about cybersecurity, branching off of that a little bit. If we could try to keep the answers brief, because there are a lot of issues that we want to get to. I mean, you mentioned that there's the working group, but it seems like the House and Senate are still on very different pages about what legislation would look like. Is there any chance that we're going to see legislation enacted? And if it's dead, is the controversy over the NSA surveillance, is that what killed it? I mean, is there more concerns about privacy? People more worried about introducing something that's going to upset the privacy advocates?
I think the focus is not on cybersecurity per se, except to the extent that that issue is addressed constructively by the Telecom Subcommittee Task Force. I think the focus really is on the two issues of privacy and surveillance. And the ECPA reform, if it's properly drafted, can constructively address the question of surveillance. I think the public is understanding of the need for this country to protect itself against the threat of terrorism. I think you get unanimous support for the country doing that. You get a lot of differences as to how the country ought to go about doing it. And I think people are genuinely concerned that the reach of NSA is poorly understood and that better clarity is needed with regard to that, and that when truly sensitive information, such as the text of telephone messages, the content of those messages, the texts of email, which contain highly sensitive information, are accessed by government, that there be some proper showing of belief that the individual involved has been involved in the kinds of activities that would warrant that receipt of information. A warrant with probable cause is the best and well-established way to do that. And so the ECPA reform can very successfully, I think, address the question of surveillance. The question of online privacy, I think, is another area where Congress should focus, but I see no signs that it's planning to do so. And this is a subject that Cliff and I have a long background with, starting about a decade ago. We introduced discussion legislation for a set of protections for online privacy, founded on the concepts that any company that collects information from its customer would have to disclose what information is collected and how that information is used. If it's conveyed on to third parties, who are the third parties, what is the circumstance of conveyance, and then the customer would have the opportunity to act on that information, to either consent to that disclosed use, and that would be essentially through an opt-out, the customer not doing anything, or object to that use, which would be under an affirmative act where the customer would check a box saying, you may not use my information in this manner. This is the most industry-friendly version of the legislation. Europe likes opt-in, which is far more burdensome and would require that the customer actually perform the act of giving permission, which is very unlikely to happen in very many cases. So industry vastly prefers the opt-out approach. Cliff and I, a decade ago, recommended legislation adopting that format. We introduced a much updated discussion draft 3 years ago now, that had the same principles and would essentially empower the Federal Trade Commission to certify self-regulatory organizations that had standards for online privacy protection in conformance with the national standard as contained in that statute. And then the FTC would be given authority to enforce those standards directly against any outliers that decided not to join self-regulatory organizations. Most of the reputable companies belong to those today. In the last Congress, Senators Kerry and McCain introduced a bipartisan Senate bill that was founded on the same concepts that Cliff and I had been advocating for the better part of a decade. So the legislation is there to provide that online privacy protection. I personally think the time has come to do it. I think if Congress did that, people would be far more confident that their privacy is protected. I think that would make them more willing to use electronic commerce and other online applications. So the net effect would be positive in terms of the volume of internet traffic, not negative as some have suggested.
So the issue is cybersecurity, and as I mentioned, there's 24 bills in the House and 8 in the Senate and the remaining in the House. And I guess the leading bills are Darrell Issa's bill, which is the Federal Information Security Amendment Act of 2013, Mike Rogers' bill, the Cyber Economic Espionage Act, Accountability Act, and then in the Senate, it's Rockefeller's bill. But these bills don't seem to have a consensus, and Mike Rogers' bill has taken a turn with the Tea Party. They are strongly sort of against some of the aspects about it. And the Tea Party is sort of driving the the thought process in the House, because they feel, based upon not only what Snowden revealed, but also what recently came out in the newspapers, that the judges said that the National Security Service has violated over 1,000 times. So that's created this problem. But I think the president's frustration when he issued his executive order in February on cybersecurity, which is a very light document, which he was trying to say, let's get moving, to show you how difficult it is, and Rick touched upon this, that there are stakeholders involved with the mobile devices that we have that are all over the world. I just want to give you an example. In China, in this Chinese city of Chengdu, there's 16,000 separate companies registered, and 820 of them are foreign investment companies. 189 are Fortune 500 companies: Intel, Microsoft, SAP, Cisco, Oracle, IBM, it goes on. So all they're providing parts and services that are built in, whether it's a mobile device for Apple, or whether it's a mobile device for Samsung, or whether even Huawei. So cybersecurity is not really a single country issue. It's specifically, it transcends everywhere, and stakeholders and government involved. So, in fact, I think the European Commission has set up a private cybersecurity commission, and perhaps the United States, we need to develop a consensus too, where the private sector runs this, and not necessarily having it come from the legislative side, so that the private sector would say, these are the consensus for cybersecurity. And I think when Bloomberg does their cybersecurity hearing in October, and the Chamber of Commerce does it in September, that really should be the driving force, is get the private sector to tell the legislators, this is where they have the knowledge, they have the information, so why don't they start telling the legislators what's required here? But I think we've reached a decision point because of Stuxnet, what we saw there, and Flame. We can't continue the current path, and there's got to be some cooperation from the private sector and the government, so that you have this confidence that the private sector can say, this is where the problem is, and the government can understand it.
Yeah, the members of Congress are back in their districts now, holding town meetings and so on. I doubt many of them are getting questions on cybersecurity. And as a result, I don't think anything's going to happen on cybersecurity, despite some pretty solid efforts. Now, with that said, I will also say that I'm not sure, at least for the players in this room, that that's necessarily a bad thing. I suspect most of the companies that are represented in this room, most of the companies in the high-tech and telecom sector, are doing a pretty good job of protecting and securing their networks. The problem is a lot of the players who are not in this room, who nevertheless have heavy where problems could have a heavy impact on society. And so, we all know the list in the financial areas and the utility areas and so on. And so that's where I think the bigger problem is. But there could, for a lot of players in this room, some of the legislation that is thought about could create more problems and reduce our ability to protect our networks than than if nothing is done. So I'm not sure that it's all bad that nothing is happening in this Congress, because don't feel confident that we would necessarily get good policy out of the Congress if they did act.
I imagine an issue that members of Congress are hearing about in these town halls is the NSA surveillance. Mm-hmm. Is that something, do we expect changes to happen? And I thought the most recent revelation was about how many violations were happening, and also it's unclear how informed Congress was, even the intelligence committees, of exactly how these violations were happening. So do you think that there'll be reforms that actually get done? And if so, are those reforms mainly going to be about oversight and transparency, or are they going to be more fundamental changes to the NSA's surveillance power?
In my view, they ought to be focused on oversight and transparency. I guess, first of all, to put this in perspective, and I don't proclaim to be an expert in this field, but to put this in perspective, the numbers of violations are pretty limited when you look at the whole scope of activity. And it appears as if, at least I don't find any evidence so far that any of them were deliberate. There were mistakes in, some errors in entry of data into computers. There were things that happened, but given the extent of the program, I think the fact that there are some of these issues that they were reported by the NSA is encouraging. Now, having said that, the problem in our system, the way we protect our rights is if there is transparency that we know someone is potentially doing something that could impair or affect our rights. The problem with this program is that you don't have any ability to know what's happening so that you could actually do something to assert your rights. And so I think the transparency issue is the big issue from that needs to be looked at by the Congress.
I sort of agree with Tom in what he's talking about oversight and transparency. But the politics of it is that back in the districts, if you stand up in a town meeting in 200 people and you start to talk about some of the issues, you can get divulged, inundated with all these questions about why the government is seeking to listen to my phone calls or look at my emails. The big picture is, as Tom pointed out, that we've been safe since 9/11, and more importantly, there have been no really things that have caused a problem because we caught them. And the reason we caught them is because of the Patriot Act. Now, you go back to the district and say that, and I can tell you in a pretty strong Republican district, they are against the Patriot Act. And you saw the vote on the House floor where they were going to strip out some of the provisions that were in the Patriot Act because they felt it was an intrusion upon the privacy of Americans. So that is a big issue, and it's a political issue that Speaker Boehner has to deal with because he's got to show somehow that the Republican side is interested in limiting the National Security Agency from doing this. And regardless of the facts, the politics is such that there's going to be some more votes on this. And the congressman who offered that amendment has indicated publicly that he's going to have another vote on it because he only had it on the appropriations bill where he is limited on the kind of provisions he could put in the amendment. But once he gets in another venue, then he can offer it, and it might pass. And so that, I think, is a problem that the Speaker has to deal with.
I think the main need here is transparency and better public understanding of what NASA is actually doing. The reality is that NASA is acquiring metadata. It's acquiring numbers that are called, times of conversations, and it has a very large database that contains the history of all of that going back now for almost a decade. Longer than the telephone companies keep their records, and the reason the NSA needs to have that comprehensive database is to be able to do that backward search on very short notice and have the database adequate in order to accomplish it. So, I think if the public understood that it was metadata being accessed, not the content of telephone calls, that would go a long way toward relieving the public's anxiety. That would help members when they're having their town meetings because you could start with the basis of real conversation about what the NSA is actually doing. I personally think it would be a mistake to legislate in this area in a way that restricts the ability of the NSA to do what it's doing at the present time, which has gone a long way toward keeping the country safe. The only time at which, as I understand it, the NSA is actually in a position to listen to the content of telephone calls is when a foreign party is part of the telephone conversation. Then the entire call is listened to, the domestic party's contribution to that call is accessed by the NSA also. But that again is within a different sphere where there is a foreign component to the conversation. There have been a few violations, as Tom indicated, 1,000 or two, and those were publicly disclosed by NASA and admitted to be errors, and presumably that conduct will be corrected prospectively in the future. So I think the main thing Congress could do that would really contribute would be to promote clarity through a series of hearings, through perhaps floor speeches by knowledgeable members, a repetition of this is really all that's involved could go a long way toward making a big difference.
I want to shift gears a little bit, ask about the FCC. We have 2 new nominees. I want to get your thoughts on Tom Wheeler and Mike O'Reilly, and also when do you think the Senate's going to get around to voting on these nominations? And I know that Ted Cruz has sort of hinted at he might hold up the nominations over this issue about political ad disclosures. So I just want to get your thoughts on that, the nominees themselves and then the confirmation process.
I don't think there's any objection to either one of these nominees, not a material objection. Michael O'Reilly has a deep background of experience working for Senator Cornyn on telecommunications policy, previously working for John Kyle, and he was a telecommunications analyst in the 1990s. So he's well prepared to undertake these responsibilities. I'm not aware of any opposition to him. And the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Commerce Committee has now given approval to Tom Wheeler's nomination. I would expect both of these to come to the Senate floor during the fall of this year. And you might have a few sidebar conversations about issues that are of particular concern to members, but I don't think in the end those will delay these nominations for any substantial amount of time. Certainly by October or November, I think we can anticipate both of these gentlemen taking their seats at the FCC.
I think the fact that the strategy that both the Democrats and Republicans have, if having the 2 of them come together, will make it possible for an ease of confirmation of both of them. I would do an observation that the fact that McConnell appointed another Senate staff member is interesting, because it appears that McConnell and some of these appointments have come from the Senate side in the Senate staffers. I know Mike O'Reilly, I think he worked on the Energy and Commerce back in the early 90s, and I don't remember him. That doesn't mean anything because there's a lot of staffers that come and go. But the only caveat I would say is that there obviously were a lot of people that applied or were interested in the FCC, and that the process came down to a Senate staffer would indicate that it's somebody that McConnell felt comfortable with, but it's not necessarily a full open selection process if it's coming continually from Senate staffers. I'd like to obviously see maybe House staffers, but at the same time, even somebody outside I think would be good. I think many of you feel you probably know these House staffers, but I think from the public standpoint, if you had somebody that was not part of Congress, somebody that had, perhaps like Tom Wheeler, who's had a lot of experience, it's been a CEO in telecommunication numerous places, to have someone like that with that experience is helpful. So, I think there is another side to this.
No, I agree with Cliff that the appointment process is broken, but this is broader than the FCC. It's the whole government. That's another whole set of issues. These 2 individuals, I think, are not both very knowledgeable, very competent and capable, and I think they'll be very fine commissioners, and the sooner they're appointed or the sooner they're approved, the better. With that said, I will say I was quite dismayed when I read the front page of the Washington Post report on the president's speech on the Connect Ed program. If you want to derail nominations, say that you're directing the FCC to spend, $2, $4, $5 billion in additional money that's going to be tacked onto the phone bill. And boy, talk about red meat for some of those on the Republican side of the aisle. It's almost an invitation for the senators to insist that they get commitments from the FCC players before they're confirmed about what they're going to do in this program. So I think that could, maybe it'll all die down by September, but I think that could be a monkey wrench in the nomination or the smooth confirmation of these two highly capable people.
I do want to get to questions. We just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to see
Just
if you
one
had
comment on it.
yeah.
I think Tom has got a very good point. It was startling to me to think that the FCC is going to add on tax onto the Universal Service Fund. Obviously, I think that's the responsibility of Congress to increase taxes, and to think that the FCC, by executive order through the FCC, would do that is very alarming to me, and which goes to, I think, when Tom agrees with me that the selection process is not working, is not satisfactory, needs reform. Some of the outstanding FCC commissioners that came from outside Senate staff or House staff probably would not get appointed today. Some of those very successful, very powerfully, intellectually, shall we say, competent individuals who probably wouldn't have been there in this process. So I think the selection process needs to be changed. And I think, as Tom pointed out, that each of these are going to have to say, are you willing to vote to tax Americans on the Universal Service Fund? And as Bill pointed out in his opening comments, the Universal Service Fund, as we know, a lot of the money is being not used well.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that what's so sad about this is, of course, the school and library program needs to be reformed. We've been spending a couple billion a year for 15 years on this program, and times have changed. The program should be updated and improved, and the money should be refocused, and all of that could be done. That is what should have been said. But why you need to ignore what has already happened, the fact that we're already spending almost a couple billion a year, and instead call for these new initiatives, I mean, it just is unfortunate the way this rolled out, in my view.
All right, I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Alan Rawls, Sidley, Austin. On the privacy issue, it's a very cross-cutting issue, as you all know very well, obviously, and in Congress, committee jurisdiction often determines the shape of policy that's enacted or not enacted. On privacy, you see judiciary having an interest on the constitutional front, and energy and commerce, and we've got healthcare data, financial data, all the different committees of jurisdiction. Likewise, on the executive branch, there's really no particular focus for the privacy issue. Would you think that the development of policy would be enhanced if Congress were able to have some kind of a cross-cutting approach to that would counteract the diffusion of responsibility and focus on privacy, and get people from the different committees? And I don't know if that's at all feasible. I think it probably isn't. But do you think diffusion of responsibility and focus in Congress and the executive branch is a factor in the non-development of privacy policy?
I think I would respond by saying that it has been developed pretty comprehensively, but in sector-specific ways. So with regard to financial services, healthcare, telecommunications, we have a complete set of privacy principles that have been adopted in legislative vehicles over the years, emanating, as you suggest, from different committees, but the result has been pretty good. What we don't have is a general right of online privacy, and the legislation that Cliff and I put forward is designed essentially to be a gap filler. So it would not apply where you have a more specific privacy guarantee for a given industry. It wouldn't apply for financial services, healthcare, telecom, or any other area where privacy is established by other statute. And I think once that is done, we could say that we do have a pretty now comprehensive set of privacy assurances. I know that you, Alan, are concerned about the perception of U.S. privacy practices in the European Union, and the fact that they tend not to acknowledge the very good privacy practices that we have in these sector-specific areas, and that's a reality. I think if we could claim that we had a comprehensive set of privacy assurances covering all of the various areas, and adopting the kind of legislation that Cliff and I have been putting forward, I think would take us to that point. Then perhaps we could say to the European Union, we really do have parity with you. In some regards, our privacy is better. Our enforcement is better than yours. You may have more formal law in some areas than we do, but if you look at the overall effect, privacy assurances in the United States are probably superior to what they are in the EU today. I'm concerned that this disparity in reality and perception could pose a major barrier for the U.S.-European Free Trade Agreement. And I'm very hopeful that some appropriate focus can be placed on the subject matter during that series of discussions, leading to a better understanding in Europe, at least, of how we do things in the U.S. To answer your question specifically, I really don't think this is an area where what is very hard to achieve in Congress, and that is cross-committee cooperative efforts, would bear very much fruit. And there may be areas where that's more required, cybersecurity, for example, where multiple committees are, in fact, weighing in than on privacy per se.
Alan, when you think about it, where is the jurisdiction over privacy? It comes from the Federal Trade Commission. And which committee or subcommittee has that jurisdiction? Well, it's Energy and Commerce and the Commerce, Consumer Protection and Trade. So they have the internet jurisdiction through the Federal Trade Commission. So really that is the subcommittee where it should. And I was chair of that, and I had 7 hearings on privacy. So it's up to really, in the House, the Republican leadership, to say, okay, maybe the Banking Committee is interested and maybe the Judiciary Committee, but they don't have the major piece of jurisdiction. They don't have the Federal Trade Commission. And so you have already the structure available to pass a privacy bill out of the Energy and Commerce. It could be done. There's just an element within the Republican Party that is very conservative and meets the very liberal on privacy, whether it's opt-in or opt-out. And under that whole challenge to give the consumer whether he's going to opt-in or opt-out is where you have the Ed Markeys and the Joe Barton come together, and they have formed the Internet Caucus. And they were the difficult ones because what the majority of Republicans would think, perhaps they would not. And so, but to answer your question, fundamentally we have within the House the jurisdiction and we could pass it.
The jurisdictional disputes are always a problem with almost anything you take up in Congress, so I don't think this is a unique problem for the privacy issue. And I agree with basically what Rick and Cliff said, but with this caveat. I think that the privacy policies that are in place today are extremely unfriendly to consumers. Consumers have no clue what the policy is for access to their data, the use of their data. We all get these privacy statements from everybody. Who reads these things? How often do you read all the privacy rules before you say you want to click through on the website? You get this stuff from your bank. How many of you have read these privacy statements that come from your bank, your insurance company, your medical provider, and all this stuff? Man, it's very unfriendly, and there's no uniformity of expectations from sector to sector, I think. So I just think that the policies have been developed from the standpoint of industry, not from the standpoint of what does the consumer need to know, what are the choices the consumer should have the ability to make, and how do you facilitate that? And so I just think that the policy, in a sense, the policy isn't that bad, but the reality is that it is disconnected, I'd say, from the consumer.
We have time for a few more minutes for a question if anybody has any more questions.
Thank you. I was just curious, in my experience, and admittedly I'm quite biased, it seems that the broadcasters are perhaps one of the most resistant industries to creative destruction, and I was curious about the panel's thoughts of retransmission consent reform. Should Congress be interested? Will they act, et cetera?
It depends whether you have to go before the National Broadcasters Association to ask for a favor. When I was in Congress, I found the retransmission consent a very debatable. When you hear both sides of the argument, it's still a question of what's the right thing to do. The larger issue I found with the broadcasters is that in spectrum policy, we wanted to, when we moved from analog to digital, the broadcasters have all got this huge amount of digital, and now the government wants part of it back, and they're trying to set up an auction process where the broadcasters will give some of it back and it'll get paid for it. But under that seemed to be what the broadcaster would concentrate on me so much, is we want to make sure that the government doesn't confiscate it by eminent domain, take a lot of our spectrum that we have, because we're going to use it and we don't know how we're going to use it, but we don't want to lose the possibility of future expectations.
It seems to me this is an area where we have too much policy. I should get rid of the whole scheme and allow these negotiations to occur among private sector players. They're all big players. They can look out for themselves, and I don't think that we should. I mean, I think the must-carry rules, the retransmission consent rules, all these things are just an anachronism, and we ought to get rid of them. You know, you may need a little transition here or there for some of the players, some of the smaller players, or and a little bit of protection, but this scheme just doesn't make any sense anymore, in my judgment. The other observation I'd make is that you know, the bigger issue with the broadcasters, but government as a whole, is the spectrum issue, and we haven't talked much about that today, but we have to totally rethink the way we look at spectrum. I mean, first of all, you've got government agencies have no incentive to free up spectrum. Yes, yet they've got most of it. And we have to figure out, we should be looking at spectrum at the federal level like we do property or buildings, you know, where you have an entity that manages the spectrum for the federal government and tries to make the use of that spectrum as efficient as possible, and where spectrum usage is part of the budgets of, they have to lease the spectrum on an annual basis as part of their budgets, so they've got some incentive to reform and improve and become more efficient in the way in which they use spectrum. And on the private side, we shouldn't have the FCC in the middle of every transaction. We should be treated, the FCC should be more like a planning and zoning commission, where they may have zoning rules for spectrum, if you will, usage rules, but that they don't have to be as long as the owners are abiding by those rules, they shouldn't be involved in every transaction. The process really now is fraught with problems, and we need to rethink, you know, not just tinkering here and there with both the video issues and the spectrum issues, not just tinkering, we need to rethink the structure of these policies.
All right, well, unfortunately, I think we are out of time, but I want to thank the panelists for taking the time. That was an interesting discussion, so thank you. Yeah, thanks.